tremendous moral progress in the last 50 years in most societies. We've become aware of suffering to a far greater extent.
So you left Rhodesia at the time to go to university in Edinburgh.
That's right, yes.
Had there been no other link with Scotland before that?
Well, my father's Scottish, so I had family in Scotland.
So you had been travelling back and forth?
No, I hadn't. No, I'd spent my own childhood in southern Rhodesia.
So what was that like when you first went to Scotland?
Well, it was very much as I'd expected it. I was still pretty young, and I was very adaptable, and I responded rather well to it. I liked it. I like Scotland very much indeed. So I felt fairly quickly at home, and I've spent the rest of my life, most of my life, in Scotland since then, with one or two periods away. I lived for a year in Ireland, and I've spent brief periods in the United States and elsewhere, and indeed in Botswana and Swaziland and countries like that. But generally speaking, it's Scotland.
You went to Botswana in the early 90s. Were you already writing at that stage?
Well, I started going to Botswana a little bit earlier than that. I was writing at that stage. I was writing short stories. I was writing children's books. I ended up writing over 30 children's books. And indeed, in the first period that I spent in Botswana, I had one of my children's books published, and then I continued to do those. So when I was in Botswana, although I was writing, I had no idea that I would write about Botswana and end up having a very, very long literary conversation with the country.
So what was the difference between the writing that you did then, apart from the fact it was aimed at a younger reader? What was the difference, do you think, in your writing?
Well, I think at that stage, I probably wasn't writing with quite the same voice that I developed later on, and I was probably also writing for a smaller audience, much more limited audience.
Does that make a difference when you know you have a larger audience?
I think it does. I think yes. I think that my voice hadn't been freed at that stage, in that I hadn't really met with any great success as an author. I had a very small readership, and I was publishing on a very small scale. But once I wrote something that appealed to a very wide number of people, that was actually, for me, that was very liberating, because I had written that particular book, The Number One Ladies Detective Agency, which was the beginning of all this. I had written that in the voice that I wanted to use. That was authentically my voice. And initially I had difficulty getting it published, and I thought, well, here we go. This demonstrates that I've got to write in another voice in order to get published. But when it took off, and people said to me, no, you can write as you want to write, that was very liberating and exciting. So I was then able to write all sorts of things that I really wanted to, which I wouldn't have been able to do before that point at which the books became commercial success, because commercial success vindicates you in a sense. Publishers then say, that's fine, write what you want to write, which is a wonderful thing to hear.
So you say that was the first time you'd really found your voice.
Yes.
Did it surprise you, the places your voice took you to?
Yes, it did, in a way. I think that I was a bit surprised that I was writing in a female voice. That's certainly the first thing that surprised me, that I should write as a woman almost. I mean, I wasn't overtly writing as a woman, but certainly it was a woman's perspective on the world, and I hadn't realized that I would do that, and I discovered that I enjoyed doing that, and I like that because I find the conversation of women interesting. Women do talk about different things from the things that men talk. I mean, we're constantly being told that we're not to say that or not to think that, and there's this view that gender differences are purely the result of social conditioning. Even if that is the case, I think it is still true that conversation differs.
You were trying through that series to address a kind of a sense of obligation, I suppose, in terms of the West's exploitation of Africa. Are you satisfied that you've been able to do that?
Well, I haven't really written too much about that. I mean, I do occasionally talk about the sense that people in Africa will have that they've been taken advantage of, and indeed they have. Really from the time of the scramble for Africa in the 19th century onwards, Africa was regarded as somewhere that colonial powers could move into and strip of its wealth. That wasn't the entire story. I mean, there was also interest in, I suppose, in what one might describe as cultural and religious missionary activity as well. But the books aren't really very political in the sense that I don't go into that in any great detail.
And that's on purpose, isn't it?
Well, yes, because I think there are lots of people writing about that side of things and writing about it very well, and there are plenty of people who will cover these matters. There are plenty of people who will cover the problems of sub-Saharan Africa, who will look at difficulties of corruption and the relative failure of the modern state during certain periods in sub-Saharan Africa. All of that is being covered, and I think it's important that we shouldn't focus on that to the exclusion of other things. So what my Botswana books are doing, I suppose, is saying, well, look, there's a normal life which goes on in spite of problems in Africa, and there are a lot of very fine people leading good lives there. So I don't think we should pathologize sub-Saharan Africa. I think that's a mistake if we regard it just as being an area in which there are all sorts of problems, famine, civil war, corruption, etc. That pathologizes a whole continent or part of a continent, and I don't think that's fair to people there. So my books describe good lives in Africa.
You didn't even, I suppose, hone in too specifically. You dealt with the issue of HIV/AIDS, but I don't think you even mentioned it by name.
No.
Why was that?
Well, I do actually deal with it indirectly, or I allude to it. You're quite right to say that I don't actually mention it by name, and there are reasons for that. I have been criticised for that, and I've sometimes been criticised very strongly for not talking enough about that. I do, however, have my reasons, and I think I can defend my position in that I feel that if I put HIV/AIDS at the centre stage of these novels, it would change the nature of the novel, and they would become tragedies. Now, I'm not setting out to write tragedies. In fact, if you write tragedies, then people will say, oh, here's another bleak vision of life in Africa, here's another tragedy, and they may not read them at all. So you'd get people who wouldn't engage then with Africa in a positive way, which is one of the things which I hope the books have managed to do, to get people who wouldn't normally consider it to actually say, gosh, well, this looks rather interesting, and what good lives these particular people are leading. So that was one of the reasons. The other is that you've got to be very careful when you're dealing with the grief of others, because I think that in those countries, people who were, particularly in the earlier stages of the epidemic, were devastated by what happened to them. And there wouldn't be anybody in a place like Botswana who wouldn't know somebody who had been lost to this cruel illness. And you've got to be very, very careful with other people's grief and fear. And so I didn't want to barge in there as an outsider and talk about this very, very sad development in their societies, which was causing them a lot of sorrow. because other people can do that, and they say, "Oh, you're all sick," which is a terrible thing. People they don't want to be seen as being sick. Who would want to be regarded as a sick society?
As an author, how did it feel to see your work put on screen, made into film, made into television? Does that feel good, or does that take away something for you?
I'm very happy for people to make films or television programs about my books. I'm not particularly excited one way or the other about it. I'm very happy if it's done well. I was very fortunate in that the rights were obtained by Anthony Minghella, who was such a wonderful director, and Anthony Minghella couldn't have made a bad film if he tried. He really was a very fine director. He went off to Botswana, met people, tried to understand the society, spent time with people there, and in fact he respected their society and their values, and they responded very well to him. They liked him, and I knew then that it was in safe hands, that we wouldn't get a travesty of what the books were about, and so the films actually respected the ethos of the books, and then they got very good actors to play the parts. I had a meeting when they were filming in Botswana. I had a meeting with the actors, and people said to me, "Oh, is Mara Motswe as you imagine her to be?" And I said, "It's fine, because I actually don't see my characters' faces. I see the way they dress, and I'll hear their voices, but I actually don't. I never describe their faces." And so Jill Scott was fine as far as I was concerned. She had a smile, which is all that Mara Motswe, as far as I was concerned, needed to have, and she was traditionally built. And that's it.
Is that important, not to describe characters too physically?
Well, I think I don't, because I like to leave the reader to do quite a bit of that, to do quite a bit of the imagining. So I think that when you're describing a character, or indeed a scene, you actually really can use a very delicate brush. So you don't have to ladle it on with oil paint, rather like a sort of impasto painting. You can use a little delicate watercolour brush to just hint at what you want to convey. So when, for example, I'm describing Botswana, I'll sometimes just describe the sky, or I might describe the wind. I like describing winds. And that triggers associations in the reader's mind. And the reader then said, "Oh, yes, I can see it." You may have used very, very few words to do it, but the reader has actually created the picture in his or her mind, and that's what counts.
You're a very fast writer. I've heard it's about 1,000 words an hour. Mm-hmm. You produce 3 or 4 books a year.
Yes.
So you can keep a lot of balls in the air. Have
Yes.
you ever not been able to write?
I'm very lucky in that I haven't. I feel people keep saying to me, "Don't you suffer from writer's block?" This is something that people seem to be quite keen on. But people often ask you about writer's block, almost as if you've had flu this year. Have you had flu or writer's block? In fact, you can imagine the immigration forms. Have you ever suffered from writer's block? I think writer's block is probably depression. It's another name for depression. And people who suffer from writer's block are either depressed or alternatively haven't really got any ideas there, which is so it's a condition which is a bit peculiar.
Interesting that you mentioned the depression, because I think one thing that characterises your work is your optimism.
Yes.
Was there a specific time that you decided you wanted your writing to look at, I suppose, the positive side of life?
I think so, yes. I think after I'd written the first of the Botswana books, the #1 Native Detective Agency, I decided that would be where my efforts would lie. I thought that was what I wanted to do. I had discovered what was for me my authentic voice, my bit that I had to do. And since then I've written books which, generally speaking, are positive. That's not to say that I haven't dealt with poignant matters or sad matters, but always against a backdrop of possibility and the possibility of things working out well.
Because Scotland particularly, and I think this is something I discussed with you when I last met you,
Yes.
I suppose there's a big genre both in film and in writing of the miserabilism
Yes.
of Scotland. And you've often talked in quite negative terms about your concerns about alienation
Yes.
in societies. Is there not a place for miserabilism?
Well, there's a place for miserabilism. There's a place for a certain amount of bleakness and contemplation of bleakness, or contemplation of the miserable. But I don't think it should dominate. I would have thought that we're in danger of persuading ourselves that entertainment can only be had through the contemplation of confrontation, suffering, and aggression. Look at contemporary films. It seems that before you get the audience's attention, you have to have fairly substantial pyrotechnics. So you actually have to have major fires and explosions, or an autopsy scene. Autopsies are tremendous entertainment today. I mean, we seem to love having autopsy scenes all over the place. Now, that, in my view, is a little bit concerning. Obviously, the occasional autopsy, the occasional post-mortem is okay. But do you want that all the time? Do you want confrontation and in-your-face aggression to be the standard diet of entertainment? People shouting at one another, treating one another badly. I think that's questionable.
What do you think produces the alienation that concerns you at the moment?
Well, I suppose, where does one start with that? I think that societies can become jaded. Societies, particularly when they have enjoyed a considerable period of prosperity, relative prosperity, can wonder what their purpose is, or people can wonder what their purpose is. People may find that they don't have much of a purpose. Conditions of modern life may alienate people. If you look at people who, for example, can't find a job because many of the menial jobs or straightforward unskilled jobs, for example, are now being done by machines or being done abroad. But I suppose mostly by machines. These people will feel, well, what is our role in society unless they've got a skill? There's a very big problem that we have in Britain, for example, and I don't know how much of a problem it is in Australia, but certainly in Britain we have a big problem of young males who can't see a role for them in society. They're bored, they've got nothing to do, they feel unwanted, unloved, etc. Now that is very, very sad. I think that is so. These things are producing that sort of condition, and I suppose also as societies lose their sense of purpose, when they feel that they no longer have to create a civilization, for example, or when they lose a religious belief that may have motivated them. Then they may feel, well, life is meaningless and pointless, and all we can do is drink. We have a very serious alcohol abuse problem in Scotland, a very serious problem, and it's affecting younger and younger age groups, and that's quite distressing.
You talked about the difficulty with getting jobs, the
Yes.
alcohol abuse in
Yeah.
Scotland. This year, Scots will vote in a referendum.
Yes.
Do you think those sorts of, I suppose they're types of identity issues,
Yes.
can that be solved by an independent Scotland?
I don't think necessarily so. No, I don't think that that would change anything very dramatically. I think you have to, I suppose, ask some very serious questions about people's sense of control over their destiny and their fate. And I suppose if people feel that power is distant from them, that they've got no relationship with those who control their lives, then that's going to lead to a certain amount of alienation. But I don't think that if Scotland voted yes in the referendum in September, and it then became an independent state either within or without the European Union. That wouldn't solve any of those problems straight away. Those problems are very, very deep. They're very deeply ingrained.
Does the prospect of a referendum excite you?
Well, I think it's interesting. It's certainly we're going through a very exciting period of political history in Scotland. This is and indeed in Britain as a whole. For a long time, I don't think the penny actually dropped in England as to what was entailed in this. Now people south of the border are thinking about it and realizing that this is an issue of fundamental importance for the UK, and it's an issue of some importance for the wider European Union as well, because there are other countries in which this is an issue as well. Spain, for instance, is watching this with some interest. So it is certainly it's very exciting, and it's interesting to see how the argument is progressing.
Do you know which way you'll go?
Well, what I do in the polling booth is of course private. I mean, there are curtains, and so I tend not to answer that.
Have you already made up your mind? Whichever way you're going to vote?
Yes, I think I have. Yes.
I think it was more than 100 years ago, British couples used to escape to a town on the border, Gretna Green, to get married in Scotland.
Yes.
Because the laws were different.
Yes.
I noticed that your recent writing, particularly with your novel The Forever Girl, you wrote a book about the poet W.H. Auden, seems to have, if not a preoccupation, a focus on the issue of love, spirituality, and I suppose words that aren't said or held back. What's this about?
I've always written about love, and I've always written also about friendship. I'm very interested in friendship. That to me is a fascinating subject. And in these recent novels, Trains and Lovers and The Forever Girl, I've actually brought those to the forefront. In The Forever Girl, my most recent novel, I'm looking at the whole issue of undeclared love, because I think that's a wonderful, poignant issue. The fact that somebody can love another person and love another person for years and years and years and not be able to tell that person is quite a story, isn't it? There's a certain grandeur to that.
Is it something that you've gained clarity on over the years, do you think?
Well, I think the more one goes through this life, the more I think you understand the complexity of human emotions, the more you see them. And I think that inevitably, as one gets longer in the tooth, the more you see of love and what it means for people and what people's hopes and ambitions are in their lives and how they go about achieving them, the more you understand human disappointment. I think that's another thing that can come home. The sense of disappointment in life can be quite poignant. So I think that I probably personally understand it a bit more than I did 20 years ago or 30 years ago. I think that I wouldn't have made much progress if I didn't understand it a bit better. The understanding, I think, is different from how would one put it? Understanding is different from sympathy, because you may actually, as you become older, you may become less sympathetic. You may become crustier. You may become more disapproving, but you actually may understand more. But you may disapprove a bit more. I try to not to disapprove too much. I think you can try and control your disapproval of the world. You see things that you think, oh my goodness, look at that. So, for example, I'm less tolerant of certain things than I used to be. I'm less tolerant of bad behaviour. I would feel angrier if I saw an egregious example of bad behaviour, say somebody pushing somebody aside in the street or something of that sort, little example. I would react more strongly now, internally, than I would 20 years ago.
Well, you've been very patient with me. Sandy McCall Smith, thank you so much for joining us on 1+1.
Thank you very much indeed, Jane. Thank you.